What if I told you that most reactions are actually not a choice? Researchers have found that about 65% of reactions are actually initiated by habit rather than conscious decisions. And while some of these habits have been developed to help us support our goals, there are some bad habits that if maintained for a really long time, they can have detrimental effects on our lives. For that reason, today I'm going to be explaining 3 things: the neuroscience behind habit formation, how long habits take to form, and how to change bad habits. Habits are behaviors that were repeated long enough to become automatic. They start as any other behavior, and through repetition they're reinforced and then become automatic. As opposed to goal-oriented actions, we're not as aware of the sequence of events that is evoked. A context cue such as a location, a time, a person, or even emotional state can function as a cue that elicits the behavior. This is what allows us to do things such as brush our teeth, drive, or clean up right after eating without having to think about it. When we're doing these actions, we don't require a significant amount of mental effort to complete them. It feels like they're just happening naturally. With repetition, the brain recognizes the cue, anticipates what typically follows, and then facilitates the execution of the behavior. And what's interesting is that one of the major ways in which we can differentiate a habit from a goal-oriented action is reward evaluation. In other words, we can identify the behavior as a habit if we keep repeating it, even when the reward is absent or when it became aversive. Once they become automatic, the brain is no longer trying to evaluate whether this is good or bad for you, signaling its inflexibility compared to goal-oriented actions. Though they're inflexible, they actually do have a function. They work as the default setting for our brain. This is because they require little amounts of mental effort, therefore saving us energy. We don't have to think of all of the details required to execute a specific sequence of actions. Now simply having a cue is able to evoke it automatically. And that's why knowing about the 3 components of habits is very important. Charles Duhigg, the author of The Power of Habit, mentions that the habit loop has 3 components. The cue is what triggers the behavior. The routine is the behavior itself, and then the reward, which, as the word suggests, is the reward that you get as a result. The same model applies to both good and bad habits, and this is because the brain cannot differentiate between what's good and what's bad. It simply learns from repetition. Makes those neural connections stronger, and this is a way of neuroplasticity. So the cue of seeing your running shoes can make you go running in the morning. That's going to be the behavior. And then as the result, you're going to get endorphins. That's your reward. An example of a bad habit can be, for instance, having the cue of you feeling bored. That's going to cause you to use your phone and start scrolling on it. And then as the reward, you're going to get a distraction, you're not going to feel bored anymore, you're going to be entertained. And a lot of the times, actually, what's a bad habit, it's simply an action that gives you an immediate reward that doesn't align with a long-term goal. This is the basic concept behind habit formation. However, we're going to go a little bit deeper into its neuroscience. Besides the strengthening of neural connections, there's also a shift that occurs between the brain areas and circuits that are being used when we go from goal-oriented actions to habits. Early in learning, before a habit has been formed, the behavior is said to be goal-directed. We do it consciously and it's dependent on the reward. In other words, we're aware of the sequence of actions, and if the reward becomes absent or aversive, we stop repeating the action. These behaviors at this point are primarily associated to the corticostriatal associative loop, which connects the prefrontal cortex, orbitofrontal cortex, as well as the dorsomedial striatum. The corticostriatal loop is the loop that goes from the cortex, the outer part of the brain, to the striatum, which is within the basal ganglia in the center of the brain, and back to the cortex again. These loops function to modulate actions as well as other mechanisms. Going back to the early stages of learning, the action is initially performed for the reward. And then through repetition as well as the midbrain dopamine systems, we reinforce these behaviors. And before we continue, it's essential to clarify that dopamine is usually known as the pleasure hormone. However, it has a lot more functions. In this case, it's actually functioning as a teaching mechanism. This through a mechanism called the reward prediction error system. Or in other words, the discrepancy between the anticipated reward and the actual reward obtained. This mechanism works is that it's going to cause an increase in dopamine if you get an unexpected reward. It's going to cause some dopamine or no dopamine if you get an expected reward. And if you don't get an expected reward, then it's going to cause a dip in dopamine. And both these bursts and dips of dopamine are considered to be phasic dopamine response. And if we could try to translate an approximation of what the brain would be learning, it would be something like, oh, when I am in this context, I get a reward if I do X thing. And with repetition, this mechanism is going to start responding to the cue rather than to the reward. It's going to anticipate it and move a little bit earlier in time. So for instance, taking the example of brushing our teeth, initially when we're forming the habit, we release dopamine at that feeling of the reward, of our mouth feeling fresh and clean. But eventually, with repetition, the mechanism is going to start releasing that dopamine at the cue. So for instance, being at night in the bathroom. At this point, the brain now it's working based on those past experiences. So now it's saying, oh, I recognize this. If I see Y, then I do X. It's no longer computing the outcome value. And as this occurs, small changes with the cognitive mechanisms associated to procedural memory take place. And as behaviors become increasingly automatic, the sensory motor cortical striatal loop takes a more active role in encoding the features of the behavior. Another change also occurs within the basal ganglia because the activity moves from the dorsomedial striatum to the dorsolateral striatum. Additionally, there is a recent study that suggests that there is another mechanism that might be associated to maintaining habits, and this is the action prediction error. It is suggested that this mechanism helps to update a value-free system as well as to help us repeat actions that were taken in the past, suggesting that while the mechanism of RPE can help us to evaluate when something helps us to get a reward, once this is verified and we continue repeating the action, then it is maintained by this new mechanism. And although there is the idea that it usually takes 21 days to develop a habit, this is actually incorrect. Recent studies have suggested that it usually takes from 2 to 5 months to develop health-related habits. And individually, there's a wider range that can go from 4 days to about 355 days. So now, if we want to change a habit, how can we do this? The first thing is that it is essential to understand that it's easier to replace that bad habit than to eliminate it. And this is because those neural connections are already there. So what we have to do is to override them. So we have to maintain the same cue and the same reward and change the routine. And to do this, we have to be more aware of our actions in order to identify both the cue, the routine, and the reward. So for instance, let's say that you want to change the bad habit that is scrolling on your phone at night. You can try to change the habit by doing something different. So for instance, at that specific time at night in your room, you can try to meditate or write. Repetition, you're going to be able to change those neural connections with the new ones and then execute the new habit, while relying on 3 key factors while doing this, which are behavior frequency, context stability, and the reward. Another detail that's essential to understand is that we have to identify whether or not that a specific habit is associated to our identity. Because if we're associating that habit to our identity, it's going to be more difficult for us to change it. Example, for instance, don't justify it by simply saying, oh, I'm just a night owl, linking that habit to your identity. Because of this, a change in self-definitions can actually facilitate the formation of new habits, as long as the new actions actually align with the new definition as well. Another popular way to change a bad habit is to limit our exposure to the cue. A common example is trying to eat healthier and not buying junk food, for instance, or a lot of snacks, but instead buying fruit. This works because what we're doing here is that we're increasing the friction to maintain the old habit, eating unhealthy, by having you to go to the grocery store, go outside to buy food in order to keep that bad habit. Whereas to develop the new habit, you would simply have to go to the kitchen or get up and just walk a few steps to eat the fruit. So you're increasing the friction for the bad habit and decreasing that friction for the new habit. However, depending on the person's situation, it might be easier or more difficult to do this. because it requires us to be able to control our environment. And there's also the probability of relapsing if we see the cue outside. For that reason, it's usually a safer route to try to replace the bad habit rather than trying to limit our exposure to it. Lastly, it's also imperative to know that there are some factors or situations that can influence us and make us act in a more automatic way. And some of these are stress, limited time, and distractions. So when trying to form a new habit or change a bad one, we can try to limit these as much as possible in order to help us to act in a more conscious way and form that new habit. Additionally, situations such as life transitions can help us to form new habits, because it's going to change all of the cues that were familiar to us, so that gives us the opportunity to act in a more conscious way and form new habits. So if you're moving to a different place or changing jobs, this can be a good opportunity to form new habits that align to your goals. And that's all the information in this video. Let me know down in the comments what other topics you're interested in.